General Hospital spoilers reveal that Jacinda and Michael are growing closer in a way that no longer feels casual or temporary. And that is exactly why the new emotional turn feels so dangerous. What began as comfort between two wounded people is starting to tighten into something deeper, more intimate, and far more difficult to control. Michael is drawn to Jacinda because she does not approach him with the same history, pressure, or judgment that so often defines the rest of his life. Around her, he can almost believe that he is stepping into something honest, something untouched by the chaos that has consumed Port Charles for so long. Jacinda, meanwhile, seems to find in Michael a kind of safety she has not seen in years. A man whose steadiness makes her want to believe she could finally stop running from the shadows behind her. But the closer they become, the more fragile that connection starts to feel. Because secrets this dark do not stay buried when emotions begin to turn real. Everything changes when Jacinda finally confesses the truth about her past. What she reveals is not just a painful history or a few bad decisions. It is something far more haunting, something tied to old fears, hidden damage, and a disturbing connection to the nightmare surrounding Delilah. Suddenly, the growing romance between Jacinda and Michael is no longer just a story about healing. It becomes entangled with a much darker thread, one filled with obsession, memory, and a danger that may have been following Jacinda long before Michael ever entered her life. Her confession shakes the emotional ground beneath them because it suggests that Delilah's torment is not isolated, and that Jacinda may know far more about the forces circling that story than anyone ever imagined. This is where the real explosion begins. The haunting energy around Delilah's situation starts bleeding into Jacinda's relationship with Michael, turning what should have been closeness into a source of rising tension. Michael is forced to wonder whether Jacinda has been protecting herself, protecting him, or hiding something that could destroy them both. At the same time, Jacinda's vulnerability makes her even more compelling, because her fears feel real, her guilt-filled earn, and her desperation to be understood only pulls Michael closer even as the danger grows. The result is a relationship caught between passion and dread, trust and suspicion, tenderness and the terrifying possibility that love itself may be opening the door to another disaster. What makes the storyline so explosive is that Jacinda's confession does not calm anything. It intensifies everything. It gives emotional meaning to her bond with Michael, but it also places them at the center of a haunting new storm. Delilah's shadow now hangs over every conversation, every moment of intimacy, every promise that begins to form between them. If Michael keeps moving towards Jacinda, he may be stepping into a truth far darker than he expected. And if Jacinda truly carries the key to understanding Delilah's pain, then her growing closeness with Michael could trigger revelations that no one in Port Charles is ready to survive. Jacinda's confession about the art gallery and the name Delilah Wilson changes everything for Michael, because what first sounded like an isolated detail now feels like the doorway into a much darker history. The moment Jacinda begins revealing how deeply her past has tangled Delilah's, Michael realizes this is no longer just about old secrets or buried guilt. It is about a pattern of fear, obsession, and emotional damage that may still be alive in the present. The gallery itself no longer feels like an ordinary place tied to art and culture. It now feels like a symbol of something hidden, a carefully polished surface concealing trauma, manipulation, and memories that neither Jacinda nor Delilah ever truly escaped. As Jacinda opens up about her dark past, Michael can sense that she is carrying more than regret. She is carrying terror, and that alone is enough to convince him that he cannot remain passive. What unsettles Michael most is the possibility that Delilah's suffering was never truly understood, and that Jacinda may be one of the few people who knows how deep the darkness really went. Her confession does not bring relief. It intensifies the haunting atmosphere around them and makes Michael feel as if he is standing on the edge of a much larger war. Every detail Jacinda reveals seems to point towards a hidden conflict that has been simmering for years, one built on silence, control, and the kind of emotional scars that do not fade with time. Michael begins to think that he has to act, not just protect Jacinda, but to understand exactly what Delilah was caught in and whether the same danger is still expanding around them now. That is where the story becomes even more explosive. Michael is no longer simply reacting to another person's pain. He is stepping into a new battle of his own, one that could force him to confront enemies he cannot yet fully see. The haunting truth about Jacinda and Delilah is pushing him towards action. But action in Port Charles always comes with consequences. The deeper he goes, the more likely it becomes that he will uncover something that was never meant to be exposed. And once that happens, Michael may find himself at the center of a new war, one driven by obsession, buried truths, and a darkness that refuses to stay in the past. Michael realizes he can no longer stand back and watch events unfold after Jacinda's urgent warning about Delilah Wilson's mysterious employer. According to Jacinda, the man behind Delilah's past is preparing to come to Port Charles, and his arrival will not be quiet or harmless. The way she speaks about him makes it clear that he is not just another enemy to worry about. He represents a deeper danger, someone with power, resources, and a history of controlling the people around him through fear. For Michael, that warning changes everything. Protecting Jacinda is no longer just an emotional choice. It becomes a responsibility that could affect the safety of its entire family. As Michael begins to process what Jacinda has told him, he realizes the situation's already expanding beyond everything he expected. If this man truly arrives in Port Charles, the threat will not stay limited to Jacinda's past. It could easily reach Michael's loved one and pull them into a conflict they never chose. That is why Michael feels he must act now, before the danger fully arrives. His determination to protect Jacinda and those closest to him marks the beginning of a new shift in the story. One where Michael steps forward instead of reacting from the sidelines, and once he commits to that fight, there may be no turning back from the storm that is about to reach Port Charles. Jacinda's confession that she is pregnant would not feel like just another twist in an already messy story. It would feel like the moment everything unstable finally rises to the surface. In Port Charles, news like that never stays private for long, but this would be more than gossip or scandal. It would immediately become a source of pressure, fear, and emotional chaos, especially because Willow would not be able to keep her distance from what this revelation means. The true shock would not only come from Jacinda's pregnancy itself. It would come from how quickly that truth starts changing the emotional balance between Jacinda, Willow, and Michael, turning one confession into a much larger crisis that no one can easily control. What makes this storyline work is that Jacinda would likely confess from a place of fear rather than power. She would not be standing there triumphantly, using pregnancy as some dramatic weapon. She would be telling the truth because silence has become too heavy, because the pressure of hiding something so life-changing has become unbearable. That gives the moment real emotional weight. Jacinda's confession would feel less like an announcement and more like the opening of a floodgate. The second the words leave her mouth, she would know that her life is no longer hers alone. Every glance, every silence, every reaction around her would suddenly feel dangerous. Her pregnancy would stop being personal and become a battlefield where everyone else starts projecting their own fears, resentments, and insecurities. That is where Willow enters as the force that makes everything more intense. Willow would not need to scream or openly attack Jacinda for the pressure to become overwhelming. In many ways, it would be more effective if her reaction begins quietly, a colder expression, sharper questions. A refusal to simply accept Jacinda's confession without suspicion. Willow may tell herself that she is only being realistic, that she has every right to question the timing, the motives, and the consequences. But the deeper truth would be that Jacinda's pregnancy awakened something raw and unstable inside her. It would stir up fears about losing control, losing emotional ground, and watching her world shift in ways she cannot stop. That is what makes Willow's role in this story so important. Her pressure would not just come from judgment, it would come from panic dressed up as logic. She may begin convincing herself that Jacinda's pregnancy changes more than it appears to on the surface. She might see it as a move that threatens her place, her stability, or her ability to shape the future around her. Once Willow starts thinking that way, every conversation with Jacinda becomes loaded. Every word Jacinda says could be filtered through suspicion. Every sign of vulnerability from Jacinda might be interpreted as manipulation. And that is how a situation that should call for care and caution instead turns into emotional warfare. For Jacinda, this would be devastating. Pregnancy already brings fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability, especially if the circumstances around it are complicated. Instead of finding understanding after finally telling the truth, she may find herself under a microscope. She may begin to feel that she is not being treated like a woman carrying a child, but like a disruption no one knows how to handle. That would make Willow's growing pressure even crueler, because Jacinda may start to feel that every emotion she shows is being used against her. If she is calm, she will be seen as calculated. If she is upset, she will be called dramatic. If she asks for space, people will think she is hiding something. The pregnancy then becomes more than a physical burden. It becomes an emotional trap. This is also the point where Michael can no longer remain passive. That is one of the strongest parts of the storyline. Jacinda's confession would force him into action because pregnancy changes the stakes immediately. This is no longer a situation that can be delayed, denied, or handled through vague promises that things will somehow settle on their own. Once there is a child involved, every hesitation becomes more dangerous. Michael would realize that whatever he does next matters in a much bigger way. The emotional environment around Jacinda and Willow is already unstable, and now he has to make sure that instability does not turn toxic. What makes Michael's position so compelling is that his urgency would not come from confidence, it would come from dread. He would see Willow's pressure building and know that she is nearing a point where fear starts shaping her actions. At the same time, he would see Jacinda becoming more exposed and emotionally cornered. He would understand that if he waits too long or tries too hard to keep everyone satisfied, he could end up making everything worse. That kind of pressure can haunt a person. Michael would not simply be worrying about who is hurt now. He would be obsessing over what happens next, what kind of damage is already forming, and whether one wrong choice on his part could turn this into a crisis no one can repair. That is why Michael's role becomes so emotionally heavy. If he steps in to protect Jacinda and create boundaries around her, Willow may take that as betrayal. She may feel pushed aside, replaced, or humiliated by the very fact that Michael is prioritizing Jacinda's emotional safety. But if he focuses too much on calming Willow and preserving her feelings, Jacinda could feel abandoned at the exact moment she needs stability most. Michael would be trapped in the middle of two very different kinds of pain, and there would be no clean way out. Every decision would wound someone. Every silence would carry consequences. Willow's inner pressure could easily become the darkest part of the storyline if it continues to grow. She may not explode right away. In fact, a quieter unraveling would be more powerful. She could become more controlled, more emotionally rigid, more determined to define what Jacinda's pregnancy really means. That kind of mindset is dangerous, because once fear starts presenting itself as moral clarity, a person can justify almost anything. Willow might genuinely believe that she is the only one seeing the truth clearly. She might tell herself that everyone else is being naive, that Jacinda's vulnerability is distracting people from the bigger picture, and that someone has to push harder. But when a person starts acting from fear while believing they are acting from principle, the damage can become far worse than open anger. Jacinda would feel that damage almost immediately. Instead of being allowed to move through pregnancy with some sense of peace, she would be forced to absorb the emotional storm around her. She would likely begin questioning whether anyone truly sees her as a person anymore. Her body, her future, and her fear would all become topics for other people's judgment. That would make her confession feel like the beginning of a nightmare rather than the end of one. She might even begin to regret telling the truth, not because the truth was wrong, but because of what it has unleashed. Michael's obsession with taking action would grow from that exact realization. He would see that the pregnancy has already become more than an announcement. It has become a test of character for everyone involved. Willow's reaction reveals how deeply fear is controlling her. Jacinda's vulnerability reveals how little emotional protection she really has, and Michael's own hesitation reveals how dangerous indecision can be when a child's future is suddenly part of the equation. He would begin to understand that he is not just trying to manage a conflict anymore, he is trying to prevent the people around him from becoming consumed by this situation. That is what gives the story its strongest emotional core. The future itself becomes frightening. The problem is no longer only who feels betrayed or who holds the moral high ground. The real problem is the emotional world into which this child may be born. If Jacinda spends her pregnancy under constant suspicion and stress, if Willow keeps escalating under the weight of her own panic, and if Michael keeps hesitating because he is afraid to hurt either of them, then the entire situation will only grow darker. Every day of delay would allow more resentment to build, more fear to harden, and more damage to settle into place. In the end, Jacinda's pregnancy confession would become the spark that exposes how fragile everything already was. Willow's pressure would show how fear can turn into emotional control. Michael's growing obsession with acting would show how responsibility can become torment when every option carries pain. And the biggest shock would not just be that Jacinda is pregnant. It would be that this pregnancy forces everyone around her to reveal who they really are under pressure. Once that happens, there is no going back to the illusion that things were stable before. The confession would not create the storm from nothing. It would simply prove that the storm had already been building, waiting for one truth to break it wide open.